Well, he pitched to them not only the well-accepted concept, of course, within NATO. NATO doesn't need to be reminded of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But Albanese was keen to expand the concepts that, as he put it to me, when I talked to him about this yesterday, Albanese put it to me yesterday, concepts that have universal application. And under the rules-based order that he was speaking about, that means protecting and respecting the sovereignty of countries and operating within global rules and norms, and expanding that beyond the case of Ukraine, especially into the Indo-Pacific. Albanese told the 31 NATO leaders at the summit, plus the 4 Indo-Pacific leaders representing Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, that China was the Indo-Pacific was the dominant theatre of competition for strategic competition. That the competition was one between 2 competing versions of the global order. This is a pretty key term here. He said that there may be economic competition involved, there may be military competition, but that above all, it's a competition for differing views of the world order. So this is a fundamental contest. And Albanese said to me, the distinguishing feature of the NATO summit, and the reason that he travelled to the other side of the world, to a country most Australians would struggle to find on a map, was because, as he put it, this is the gathering of democratic leaders around the world. So he was really drawing a picture of the democracies gathering to organise themselves as they head into this epochal contest against autocratic powers. And he talked extensively about China as the dominant disruptive force. He told the other leaders that as long as China was continuing its military build-up, the biggest build-up, as he put it, in almost a century, the biggest military build-up, and with no strategic assurance and no transparency, that the world would need to continue to be wary of China's strategic intentions.
Do you think that countries, many countries had moved towards China, particularly because it was such an economic advantage? Do you think many of those democracies are now understanding how China is taking advantage of this sort of global time?
Yes, that's all the trend is in that direction, absolutely, Bev. When Australia first really woke up to what China was attempting to do, that was 2017, and the first legislative evidence of that, or government decree, was the banning of Huawei, followed by the anti-foreign interference and anti-espionage legislation under the Turnbull government. It took other democracies a few years longer to catch up and comprehend the scale of the challenge for dominance that China was waging. But a couple of years ago, we saw the European Union, in quite a conversion, declare China a systemic rival. And now at the NATO, in the NATO group, we hear in their China strategy, or in their global strategy, China described as, quote, a challenge to NATO's security, its interests, and its values, which is a pretty profound, broad-fronted challenge in NATO's words. And in the communique that the NATO leaders issued last week after their summit, it was something more than 12 times where the collective democratic leaders rebuked China or critiqued China and its conduct, bullying, coercion, and strategic and territorial ambitions. So that's a pretty profound conversion and awakening, and a whole new sense of alarm and determination from the NATO group.
Yeah, which is, as you say, while they're being so consumed by the Ukraine situation, is really important, particularly for Australia's potential role. It is interesting because A case in point is Solomon Islands. Now, we've just seen the Prime Minister come back from a visit to Beijing and really sort of giving Australia and New Zealand a real spray, saying that they are letting them down, not coming up with their funding. Do you see this as a classic example of a country sort of taking advantage of what China has on offer?
Yes, absolutely. And Sogavare, the Prime Minister of the Solomons, is really bargaining, leveraging between the two sides here to extract maximum advantage. And while you can't begrudge any Pacific Island nation using that competition to advance its own interests, for goodness sake, we've ignored most of them pretty delinquently for way too long. But in this case, what we see is Sogavare going further, not just bargaining between the Western democratic bloc and China, but going further, we see him actually. I think it's safe to say, Bev, that he is warming to China's embrace. That the spray he came out with yesterday, blaming Australia and New Zealand for failing to deliver promised budget support, essentially foreign aid delivered directly to support the functioning of the government and services of the Solomons, was a pretty strange concoction. And both Australia and New Zealand governments came out immediately and said that this is wrong, that those governments have delivered each of the $1 million, 13 million in Australia's case and more in New Zealand's, promised to the Solomons government, and completely repudiated his comments. And if you looked at the detail of Sogavare's press media conference yesterday, when he was pressed about this, he said, "Oh well, maybe some of that money from Australia and New Zealand might have turned up already. I haven't checked in the last couple of weeks. It might be here. It might be here by now." So it was a very strange and seemed very theatrical way of trying to exaggerate China's role as savior and rescuer by then saying, Sogavare said to the media, "I'm delighted to announce that China has very generously stepped in where Australia and New Zealand have let us down." So that seems a confected argument, and it seems not just bargaining between the two spheres. It seems like a deliberate insult and perhaps betrayal of one sphere to justify a more full-throated, shall I say, union with China.
Yeah, and the Solomons would be foolish to think that they were not just a pawn in China's long game. But does Australia continue to invest and double down on its Pacific policy even when it has been exploited to a degree?
Yeah, so what should a government do in that circumstance where it seems that the local ruler, Sogavare, is deliberately disavowing his Australian friend, ally agreements and crossing over to the other side, if you like. The Australian government's view, and this is borne out in its conduct and the way it's conducted itself, but also in explanations that ministers have given to me, is that we have to accept that this is now a permanent condition across the Pacific of competition where Australia is in a day-to-day, year-to-year, decade-to-decade contest for influence against China, and that Australia cannot allow itself to be discouraged, cannot allow itself to stamp its foot and go off in a huff, that Australia has to stay the course. And of course, each of these places, Solomons being a good case in point, is strategically vital to Australia. That if China were to get its ultimate ambition of a military base, it would be the first time since World War II that a rival, an antagonist, a hostile state has established a military base in the Pacific, and especially one so close to the Australian coastline.
To add to Albanese's point of the tensions in the region. Good to talk, Pete. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Beth.